When fighting on the front lines, it's vital that any and all equipment you use is capable of handling the dangerous conditions of battle. In the late 19th century, since railways play a massive part in transporting supplies, France naturally wanted a locomotive that would be dependable in the trenches, and after some research and development, they came up with a design that you could say was fairly reliable. After suffering significant losses during the Franco-Prussian War, it became clear to France that their army needed a better means of transporting supplies and munitions. Railways were of course the go-to answer for moving bulk goods, and in 1882 Colonel Pesho worked with the WWII company to produce a system that the army could use. I've done a video going into more detail that you can watch here, but long story short, WWII and Pesho developed sections of prefabricated 600mm gauge rails that could be moved around and laid easily by troops, allowing supply trains to reach remote or otherwise inaccessible places and keep their troops going. 600mm also became the standard gauge the French army used around army bases, forts, and other significant military locations. Naturally, with the adoption of a new railway network, the army needed engines that could not only run on these narrow gauge rails, but also keep working after sustaining damage on the front lines. Paul Duqueville, having visited the Festiniog Railway in Wales in 1879, proposed adopting a double Fairlie design. Fairlie's design worked by having one long boiler heated by two fireboxes, which gave the engines their unique double-ended appearance. The boiler and frames were then mounted on two sets of articulated powered bogies, meaning that not only were all of the engine's wheels powered, but the articulation also meant that it could negotiate tighter curves too. Another benefit to the design was that it was double-ended, meaning it could be driven in both directions without needing to be turned around. It was strong, flexible, and could work just as well going backwards as forwards. It was exactly what the army was looking for. Pesho, along with engineer Pesho-Bardon, began drawing up plans for their own version of a Fairlie engine, with a few modifications to make it more reliable on the front lines. It was given a double boiler instead of one big continuous one. This way, should the boiler at one end become damaged, the boiler at the other end could keep working. Similarly, should the cylinders or valve gear at one end become compromised, the engine still had an extra set with which it could finish the journey. Despite having two separate boilers, this design only had one steam dome, which was positioned in the cab on top of both boilers. And compared to its 32.5-foot Welsh counterparts, it was much smaller, measuring in at 18 feet 11 inches. The central dome and shorter boilers meant that it could safely climb the steep grades of many fortifications around France, and its low centre of mass would mean it was less likely to derail on wobbly tracks. The funnels would also be fitted with spark arresters, canvas curtains were fitted over the cab doors, and the locomotive would carry around a hose that could be used to fill up its tanks with water from ponds, ditches, and other sources, since water towers would have been rare on the front lines. By 1888, the design had been finalised, and the first of these 0440 engines, or 0220 as they were classified in France, was built that year by Franco-Belge. Dubbed the Pesho-Bardon locomotive, it was fitted with 650mm driving wheels, 240mm by 175mm cylinders, Walschaerts valve gear, and was capable of handling the steep grades, tight bends, and pulling the heavy loads around France's fortifications. Satisfied, the army decided to officially adopt the locomotive design, and by 1914, 61 Pesho-Bardon locomotives were working around fortifications all across the country. With the outbreak of the First World War, however, France found it needed more engines to help move artillery pieces and keep supplies moving to the trenches. As most French locomotive manufacturers were busy due to the war, 280 engines were ordered from the Baldwin Locomotive Works in the US, with another 15 being built by the North British Locomotive Company in Scotland, bringing the total to 356 by 1916. Despite the seeming advantages the design had over conventional engines, just like the Fairlies, the Pesho-Bardons had their own shortcomings too. As the boilers and fireboxes ran through the middle of the cab, both driver and fireman had little room on the footplate. And while this was a problem the Fairleys had too, it would have been a greater issue on the Pesho-Bardon engines due to their much smaller size. Their water tanks were problematic too, as they were too close to the boiler. While this came with the benefit of the boiler preheating the hot water also caused the injectors to not work properly, making it hard to keep the water level in the boiler stable. But the biggest problem with the engines was maintenance. Not only did engine crews have an extra set of cylinders and valve gear to maintain, but the draft in the boilers was very strong, causing soot and ash to quickly build up in the smoke box and clog boiler tubes. Given how similar they are to Fairleys too, it's safe to assume they also suffered similar ailments as their Welsh counterparts, such as lack of fuel storage, poor visibility in the cab, and problems with the flexible pipes required to move steam to and from the cylinders. Since no more were built after 1916, it's fair to assume that these drawbacks were enough to dissuade France from pursuing the design further, especially with how successful the more traditional tank engine designs used by Britain, America, and Germany were. After the war was over, many of these locomotives found a new life working on industrial railways all across Europe, while some returned to bases and fortifications in France. But with the abundance of more traditional, easier to maintain tank engines available, it wasn't long before the engines found themselves either scrapped or put to one side. Out of the 356 Pesho-Bardon locomotives built, only 2 still remain in preservation. One belonging to the Dresden Transport Museum in Germany, while the other resides at the Požega Railway Museum in Serbia. In the end, these articulated frontline engines, while sound on paper, proved to be fairly unreliable in practice. Maybe with a bit more refinement the design could have worked, but given the inherent problems with Fairley's design, it goes to show that sometimes doubling the engine can also double the burden. What comes to your mind when you think of armoured trains? One of those big, armed convoys used by the Soviets, or perhaps those cars that were just a load of sheet metal covering a big cannon used in the US Civil War. There have been many designs used throughout the years, but one armoured train stands out among the rest, not because of its military history or its superior firepower, but because it was in dire need of a haircut. By 1887, Natal Government Railways was expanding and in need of more powerful engines to keep the railway running. The engines operating at the time were primarily 060s, 460s and Moguls, all built in England, but it was felt that something more powerful was needed. Designs for a 282 locomotive were drawn up by Locomotive Superintendent William Milne for the railway, and construction of it began in 1888 at the Durban workshops. What made this engine special was it was not only one of the first few locomotives in the world to have 8 driving wheels, but was also the first engine to be built in South Africa. It was also the first tender engine on the railway too, being the very unusual combination of both tender and tank engine. Its sandboxes were mounted on top of its boiler, it had 2 different types of safety valves, Stephenson valve gear, vacuum brakes, 3¼ foot driving wheels, and a total weight of 50 long tons. After a trial run in August 1888, the engine was officially numbered 48 and named Havelock after Sir Arthur Havelock, then governor of the colony of Natal. After a few more trials, Havelock was officially put to work in January 1889, primarily running services between Durban and Cato Ridge. Being the first and only engine on the line actually built in South Africa, the engine was seen as the pride of the railway and used by the railway for publicity, attending press events and the opening of several new lines. Very soon, bigger and more powerful engines started working on the line, and Havelock quickly found itself on secondary duties. It was put to work on branch lines, being converted to a 462 Pacific wheel arrangement to help it negotiate the tighter bends. Havelock's career, however, wasn't just one of publicity, being a regular worker on the railway and eventually serving in the Second Boer War. At the start of the war, most locomotives on the line were fitted with armour plating to protect important components from bullets. But for whatever reason, be it lack of metal or not wanting to modify the engine too much, Havelock was instead given a different type of defence. 6-inch thick hemp anchor rope was taken from HMS Terrible and layered over the engine to function as armour. While maybe not as bulletproof as steel sheets, the rope would help slow down and deflect bullets while still allowing engine crews access to important components for maintenance. Havelock's bizarre appearance led to many giving it the new nickname of Hairy Mary. Despite looking more like a Commodore than a Commando, the armour seemed to work. During the war, the engine was partially derailed by Boer soldiers during an ambush. On board was then war correspondent Winston Churchill, and with his guidance and help from the soldiers aboard, the driver was able to get the engine going again and escape the ambush relatively unscathed. Once the war ended in 1902, the rope armour was removed. Havelock kept working for a few more years, but by 1905, with the introduction of the Class Ds, Cs and Es, the workloads were simply too much for it to keep up with, and so Havelock was withdrawn and scrapped that year. It's quite a shame really. Not only was Havelock the first engine to be built in South Africa, but it also proved that 8 driving wheel designs were not only possible, but viable too, leading to the creation of the Class D tank engines that went on to replace it, and the construction of many other 8 driving wheeled engines in the future. A pretty good track record, especially for a narrow gauge engine known for looking like a mop. During the Second World War, a significant amount of motive power was needed to keep the railways of Europe going. For the Allies, this came in the form of 280 goods engines from England and America, these being the Stanier 8F engines and the US Army S-160s. The 8Fs made their mark in the Middle East, and the S-160s are remembered for both their sheer numbers and American style, but few remember there was also a third class of 280 that, sadly, doesn't quite get the same amount of remembrance as its counterparts. By 1942, the war was showing no signs of slowing down, and Britain's railways were in dire need of more engines. Stanier's 8Fs were doing a good job as Britain's standard goods engine, but they were becoming more and more costly to produce. Robert Riddles, Director General of Royal Engineer Equipment, needed an engine that could do the work of the 8Fs that was also much cheaper and quicker to build. He began designing a locomotive based on the 8Fs, and by 1943, his new austerity engines were put into production. The end result was essentially a simplified version of Stanier's design. Instead of a tapered boiler, the austerity designs had simple, parallel ones. Instead of a Belpaire firebox, which was complex to build, the austerities had round-topped fireboxes. Where the 8Fs were awkward and difficult to maintain, the austerities were designed so they could be easily mended with shoelaces and whatever else you had on hand. They were also slightly lighter than the 8Fs, had a shorter wheelbase, cylinders bigger by an extra half-inch in diameter, no boiler lagging, could be converted to burn oil if needed, a narrow bunker to make them easier to drive in reverse, and, most impressively, a higher overall tractive effort than the 8Fs. On top of being simplified, they were also designed to be compatible with the 8Fs too, both having the same sized driving wheels and motion to make sourcing parts and maintenance just that little bit easier. Riddles also produced a 210 version of this design, these having a longer wheelbase, bigger boiler, and wider firebox. The 210s, however, weren't built to be better performers, but rather the extra wheels were to help decrease the engine's axle load to allow them to run on branch lines. 935 of the 280s were built, with an additional 150 210s also constructed. Though the engines were intended for use in mainland Europe, they were quickly pressed into service on Britain's railways, with the London North Eastern Railway alone borrowing 350 to cover for their worn-out Gresley goods locomotives. Nicknamed Aussies by enginemen, the Austerities managed to get the work done, but were found to have their own shortcomings, mostly their fireboxes. The drop gate mechanism often warped from the heat, and the firebox itself was criticised as being too rigid. The tube plates in the firebox were also known to crack, causing many of the engines to fail and have their boilers scrapped after less than 2 years in service. The 210s worked British rails too for a short time, but their long wheelbase made them very cumbersome to handle. Eventually, the Austerities were deployed into mainland Europe in June 1944 to help move troops and supplies, with 20 of the 210s dispatched to the Middle East. They proved invaluable to the war effort, but the Austerities didn't work for long, as by 1945 the war was over and they were no longer needed in Europe. With the War Department deeming them surplus, the LNER was quick to purchase 200 Aussies, having found how much better they were than their current, outdated goods engines. In 1946, Dutch railways, having had a significant amount of their locomotives damaged or destroyed by the war, leased many of these engines to keep their railways going while they rebuilt. 237 Aussies ran on Dutch rails, with 184 making it their permanent home, and 103 of the 210s also joining the fleet, nicknamed Little Jeeps and Big Jeeps respectively. The British-built engines had some problems adjusting to their new home. Drivers had to stand on the left side of the cab, and smoke from the engine caused visibility issues. To alleviate the problem, the engines were fitted with taller chimneys and operated at a lower boiler pressure. They only worked in the Netherlands until 1952, being either sold on or scrapped. 2 of the Little Jeeps were sold to Swedish State Railways in 1953, who were evaluating whether it was cost-effective to buy these second-hand engines to replace their outdated rolling stock. Both engines were modified to work on Swedish rails, having their tenders shortened and fitted with closed cabs before being trialled. The performance of the engines, however, was relatively lackluster, and so both were put into strategic reserve. 12 Aussies were overhauled and sent to work in Hong Kong, but little of their service history is known, other than 5 of them were converted to burn oil and 1 of them exploded. Another 16 210s meanwhile were making a name for themselves in Greece, having arrived in 1946 to pull both goods and passenger trains. They seem to have been favoured quite well, as they continued to run in service until as late as 1985. 6 of these were preserved, with 2 of them pulling tourist specials well into the early 2000s. Despite their popularity abroad, Britain seemingly had little interest in the 210s, with only 25 being brought home after the war. The 280 Aussies, however, were very welcome. Along with the 200 already owned by the LNER, the newly formed British Railways took ownership of another 533 280 locomotives in 1948, needing all the engines they could get their hands on after the toll the war had taken on the railways and their rolling stock. The poor condition of the engines, however, meant they needed extensive repairs before they could be put back into service. Slowly, they began working again, pulling freight trains all across the country, and on the rare occasion handling passenger services too. The majority of the Aussies worked along the former LNER lines along the east coast of England and Scotland, with many later spreading out and working around other parts of Scotland too. The 210s meanwhile primarily worked in Scotland, rarely going elsewhere in the country. With their help, British Railways was able to recover from the war and keep things moving, but alas, the austerities weren't designed with longevity in mind. The engines rode rough, wore out quickly, and clanged a lot as they worked, earning them the new nickname of bed irons or wooferdunks from the noises they made. Despite their intended short lifespan, the engines managed to keep working until the 1960s, with the 210s disappearing by 1962 and the remaining Aussies lasting until 1967. Not bad for what were essentially disposable engines, but given that British Railways was moving towards dieselisation, it's likely BR simply decided to keep running these engines into the ground instead of investing in new steam engines that were just going to be replaced by diesels anyway. Once withdrawn, all of the austerities that ran on British railways were scrapped. Only one 280 Aussie survives to this day, this being one of the two that ran in Sweden, now residing at the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway. In contrast, 8 of the 210 austerities have been preserved. 3 are in England, one at the Severn Valley Railway, North Norfolk Railway and North Yorkshire Moors Railway respectively, 1 is on display at the Dutch National Railway Museum, and 4 remain in Greece, 2 in safe storage while the others are unfortunately derelict. It's a shame really. While the 8Fs and S160s are often credited as the engines that helped pull the Allies to victory, little light is often shone on these machines that arguably did just as much work, and equally a shame that very few were preserved. I suppose we can take some solace in the fact that, despite their shortcomings and disposable design, they managed to work on Britain's rails for much longer than their intended lifespan. So next time you're remembering the war and its many forgotten heroes, take a moment to think of these engines, because after all they did to aid both during and after the war, well, I think they deserve a little remembrance too. Don't you? War is an awful thing. It's a time that demands sacrifice and courage for all involved, with most people who put themselves in the line of fire for the sake of others rarely making it out alive. But not all heroes who were willing to risk their lives for the sake of others carried guns or marched on the front lines. Some of them were at home, driving steam engines. It was a warm, moonlit night on the 2nd of June 1944. At 12:15 AM, a munitions train set off from Whitemoor Marshalling Yard, pulled by a War Department austerity, driven by driver Benjamin Gimbert and fireman James Nighthall. The train was made up of 51 open-topped wagons. 34 of them carried several 250-pound US general-purpose aircraft bombs, 2 were loaded with 500-pound aircraft bombs, 1 empty truck, and the rest were loaded with fuses, detonators, and tail fins for said bombs, with a guard's van at the back of the train. All the trucks had been sheeted to protect their cargo from sparks from the locomotive, and the train was making good time. At around 2 AM, Gimbert slowed the train as it approached Soham station, when he noticed steam coming from the left-hand injector. While looking out the side of the cab to get a better view of the problem, he spotted flames inside the leading wagon directly behind the engine, a wagon containing 44 500-pound bombs. Realizing the situation, he carefully brought the train to a stop and sounded the engine's whistle to alert the guard. Once the engine stopped, Gimbert told Nighthall to uncouple the burning wagon from the rest of the train, telling him to take the coal hammer with him to break the coupling should the metal be too hot to touch. In less than a minute, Nighthall uncoupled the truck and was back on the footplate as Gimbert slowly moved the engine and the burning wagon forwards, approaching the signal box at the station entrance. Signalman Frank Bridges stepped out of his box carrying a fire bucket. Gimbert called to Bridges, telling him to stop all traffic. Just past the station was open country, and both Gimbert and Nighthall knew that if they could get the wagon there, it'd explode without risk of killing anyone. The engine and wagon were slowly making their way along the platform, having made it 140 yards away from the rest of the train when the explosives finally went off. Nearly 5 tons of munitions detonated in the middle of Soham station, throwing the engine off the rails, levelling the entire building, and leaving a massive crater 66 feet wide. The people of the village were awoken by the noise, with most finding their windows broken and their doors blown open from the force of the explosion. Many folks went out into the street to see what had happened, finding the local gasworks consumed by fire. As fire crews tended to the flames, attention soon turned to the railway station, which was now essentially non-existent. Nighthall's body was found laying charred not too far from the engine, which was on its side. Bridges too was found dead on the platform, having received a severe head injury. Gimbert meanwhile was found in the doorway of the railway pub, dazed and bloodied. He was alive but had no recollection of how he got there. Meanwhile, the guard of the train, 59-year-old H.C. Clark, had relit all the lamps on the brake van and was now walking the 2.5 miles back down the line to Barway siding signal box to alert the railway what had happened, placing detonators on the line as he went to warn any oncoming engines. Clark arrived at the signal box at 3:30 AM, with the signalman describing him as in a very dazed condition. It wasn't until the sun rose that the scale of the explosion could be fully realised. Not only was the station destroyed, but 15 other houses were completely wrecked, while another 36 were rendered temporarily uninhabitable. Countless other houses received minor damage, and the gasworks had suffered significantly from the fire. At the station, both lines were destroyed. The wagon that contained the explosives was effectively vaporized. The only parts of it that were ever found was a single buffer and a socket casting. The tender of the locomotive was completely mangled, while the locomotive itself remained relatively structurally sound, with most of the damage it received affecting its platework and boiler lagging. The first 4 wagons of the rest of the munition train were peppered with shrapnel, but otherwise fine. Though the damage was extensive and the station was effectively leveled, things would have been a lot worse if it wasn't for Gimbert and Nightall's brave attempt to get the burning truck away from the rest of the train. Should all of the wagons have exploded, it's likely Soham would have been leveled completely. A breakdown train and various army support troops arrived in Soham at dawn, tending to the injured and setting about repairing the line. Incredibly, by 8:20 PM, just 18.5 hours after the explosion, the line was repaired and trains were running through Soham again, with temporary booking offices set up for passengers to buy tickets at the station. At the same time, an investigation was launched to find the cause of the explosion. It's noted that all of the wagons were sheeted properly apart from 3, one of them being the leading truck that caught fire. Rather than the sheets hanging over the side of the trucks, they were tucked inside around the bombs, a practice that was generally not done as it could allow sparks to drop into the wagon. On top of this, further investigations found some of the wagons had a layer of straw scattered across the bottom of them, meaning they weren't properly cleaned out before being loaded with munitions. The leading truck that caught fire had previously carried sulfur, and after being unloaded and inspected, small quantities of sulfur were found left over in other wagons that were said to have been cleaned. Even after another thorough sweeping, there was still residual sulfur left over in the wagons, meaning that even if the leading truck had been cleaned from top to bottom, it's likely there was some residual dust left over. What exactly ignited it is still unknown, but the tarp covering the load contained the fire, making it hard to see until it was too late. It's incredible to think that, for all the damage the explosion caused, the only lives lost were those of Nightall, Bridges, and a horse in a nearby field. For their bravery, both Gimbert and Nightall were awarded the George Cross. In the years since the incident, a memorial has been placed in honour of their bravery, and a plaque was unveiled when the station was reopened in 2021. 2 Class 66 locomotives in service today also carry their names. Like I said, war is a dangerous and terrible thing, but it's important to remember that not all heroes laid down their lives on the front lines. Some of them did it on the railway lines. The occupation of France during the Second World War was a trying time. Liberating the country became a priority for the Allied forces, and efforts were made to disrupt German operations and put Allied troops on the ground to help retake control. Some of the biggest contributors to France's liberation, however, weren't riflemen, but railwaymen. Many people in France weren't exactly happy that Germany had decided to occupy them, and naturally underground movements formed to fight back and sabotage German operations. Railways have played a major part in most wars since their invention, as their ability to move massive amounts of heavy equipment and people relatively quickly can make or break the tides of battle. Naturally, they became significant strategic targets during the war, and nobody was more aware of this than those who worked on the railways themselves. themselves. Small resistance groups here and there would attack German convoys or interfere with operations, but when word spread that the Allies were planning on landing in France, efforts greatly increased to sow as much confusion and disorder as possible. Acts of rebellion came in all shapes and sizes, the most common one being to delay important trains. Drivers would call in sick or suddenly injure themselves when summoned. Those who did turn up to work took their time filling out paperwork and gathering equipment before they even touched their engine. When inspecting wagons, workers made sure to thoroughly examine them and note every fault they found, often leading to some trains having to be moved and shunted around in order to get rid of damaged rolling stock. Some wagons would also mysteriously become uncoupled from the rest of the train when nobody was looking. Firemen preparing engines for service would neglect the fire, resulting in locomotives not properly building a full head of steam before departing, and after setting off, drivers would run the engine as slowly as they could, open valves to drop the engine's boiler pressure, stop at every opportunity, and damage parts of the engine through careless driving so as to put it out of service when the journey was over. When filling locomotives with water, crews would either not fully fill the water tanks or leave release valves open to quickly drain them while operating, requiring them to frequently stop for refills. And it wasn't just engine crews that delayed services in this way, but signalmen too and station staff would set signals to stop at any given opportunity, points and switches would be set the wrong way, sending trains into sidings or miles from their intended destination, and in some rare cases, signals would be set to all clear with the intention of crashing one train into the back of another. But delaying trains can only do so much, especially when angry German officers would threaten workers who were slacking or taking too much time. That's when the more daring acts of sabotage began. Subtle acts of vandalism involved cutting brake lines, tampering with rolling stock, and damaging locomotives. Workers in shunting yards would open valves on fuel tankers or break the locks on goods vans so their loads couldn't be properly secured. When engines were being prepared for service early in the mornings, some firemen would go engine to engine and drop the fire from the firebox. Steam locomotives take a long time to heat up, but cool down quite quickly. So their fire going out for even a few minutes could mean another hour of waiting before they were ready to work. Electrified parts of the network were also sabotaged too. The locomotives themselves weren't the easiest to sneakily damage, but they could be stopped by either cutting the overhead wires, destroying line-side power stations, or if you just wanted to delay the train, flip a switch and turn off the overhead power supply for a few minutes. Spare parts for engines being repaired were stolen, water towers and coaling stages were put out of order, and even turntables were deliberately jammed so engines couldn't be removed from sheds. All of this came with a great risk of being caught and heavily punished, but it wasn't just practical sabotage that was dangerous. Bureaucratic interference, such as important paperwork being lost or indefinitely delayed, played a massive part in messing with German military operations. The people working in railway offices were perhaps some of the most important members of the resistance, as they knew the contents of arriving and departing trains, where they were going, and how significant they were. This information would then be passed down to active fighters who could from there formulate more intricate plans to sabotage them. Office workers would also give rolling stock the wrong departure and destination labels, and so vital supplies needed on the front lines ended up in the middle of nowhere and empty wagons would be sent to army bases. In 1944, as plans for the Normandy landings were being put into motion, the Allies managed to provide resistance fighters with explosives for breaching tracks and essentially gave orders to wreck as much military equipment as possible. Initially, the explosives were used to blow out sections of rail, but was found to be ineffective compared to simply just unbolting the track and bending it out of position. Once the rails were displaced, men would wait beside the line with guns and attack supply trains that either stopped or derailed. The Germans quickly got wise to this and began creating no-go zones around important railway lines, tearing up trees and shrubbery beside the line and forbidding anyone from approaching the tracks unless permitted. Going as far as to kick people out of their homes that just happened to be beside the railway. This made armed ambushes much more difficult, but not impossible. To help get fighters to where they were needed without detection, engine drivers would let them hide aboard their trains wherever they would fit. In animal containers, under boxes and luggage, and in steam locomotives, they'd even climb inside the tender's water tank. Not just fighters, but spies and escaped prisoners would be hidden like this too in order to get them in and out of danger. As D-Day approached, rebel attacks became increasingly bold. The explosives intended for breaching rails were used to blow up locomotives, points and switches were jammed with wood, stones, or just about anything you could get your hands on, and drivers flat out started crashing their engines deliberately. Resistance members would inform drivers in the know about rails they'd sabotaged in advance, and drivers would make sure to set their engine to full speed before jumping off the footplate when approaching these broken rails. Some drivers didn't even need an excuse, they'd just find an empty train and when nobody was looking, throw back the reverser, open the regulator and watch it roll away. It was an especially effective tactic if a train had already derailed on the line ahead, as slamming another load of wagons into the wreck would not only take longer to clear, but also put more engines and wagons out of service. Places like busy main lines, shunting yards, and even locomotive sheds ended up getting jammed with wrecks, and when rail cranes were ordered to clear up the mess, efforts were made to send them as far away as possible. With the rail network in such chaos, especially around Normandy, the Allies were able to successfully land while the German forces were struggling to get equipment, troops, and supplies where they needed to be. The sabotage continued until the Allies finally had access to France's railway network. After that, suddenly sick drivers became well again, spare parts were found for broken engines, and damaged tracks were swiftly put right. As bold and fantastic as these acts of espionage were, they weren't without consequence. Railway workers and rebels alike caught in the act were arrested, tortured, and executed. Over 150 members of Resistance Faire were shot after being caught, and a further 500 were deported, many of them dying during transportation. That's also not taking into account the amount of fighters who died during ambushes and sabotage attempts, and the countless others injured. Nonetheless, their perseverance, bravery, and defiance to fight in the face of oppression certainly makes their story worth remembrance. War is a trying time for all, but let this be a reminder that in the fight against evil, not every fight is on the front lines, and that everyday people with nothing more than the tools of their trade can be just as important in the battle against oppression as those armed with guns. War often makes for unusual bedfellows, from countries that would otherwise be enemies becoming allies to everyday citizens achieving incredible feats of sabotage. One of the most unexpected allies, however, to join the battle against the Axis forces wasn't a country or even an army, but a ghost train. On the 2nd of September 1944, orders were carried out to move roughly 1,370 prisoners from Saint-Gilles prison in Brussels to Germany. Despite Belgium still being under German occupation, Allied forces were closing in, and it was realised that many of the resistance members and political figures who'd been taken prisoner would soon be released once the Allied forces took control. Not wanting them to fall into enemy hands, it was decided that the prison would be emptied and its occupants would be transported to Germany, where they'd either remain imprisoned or sent to a camp for execution. At the nearby railway station, 32 cattle vans had been shunted to a platform and a large number of SS soldiers were patrolling the station. Quick note, most sources refer to the prison vans as being either boxcars or cattle vans. It is possible, however, that they might have been French 40 and 8 cars, built to transport troops and horses, as these were used by Germany to transport prisoners and do greatly resemble cattle vans. For the sake of ease, however, I'll refer to them as cattle vans for the rest of the video. It was around 6 in the morning when Assistant Station Master Michel Petit got word that Saint-Gilles prison was being emptied, and it didn't take long for him to realise what the guards and the cattle vans were for. Being an active member of the resistance, Petit wasted little time spreading word of what the Germans were doing. Plans were formulated to attack the station to free the prisoners, but the number of enemy soldiers meant it would have most certainly ended in catastrophe. Then the railway men had an idea. Given how quickly the Allies were advancing, they knew that if they could just delay the train for long enough, the prisoners had a good chance of being freed, and so plans for a day of confusion and delay were put into motion. The resistance already had a head start. The vents on the cattle vans were initially closed, but an assistant manager at the station opened them despite threats from the soldiers, so that the prisoners could have some fresh air after the vans became stuffy and unbearably hot. Not only that, but the open vents allowed prisoners to whisper messages and pass notes between the vans. Technical Inspector Piet was asked to slow down the arrival of the locomotive that was to pull the prisoner train, and it wasn't long before every available engine in the yard was recalled to the depot. Eventually, the train's convoy number was given to Petit, which made things much easier as it meant the railway workers knew exactly which engines were being requested to pull the train, and thus which engines they had to sabotage. Spare parts went missing, points became jammed, drivers were calling in sick, and unnecessary extra checks were being made. By 9 AM, a Type 33 locomotive became available and was requested to pull the train, but mysteriously broke down before it was able to be coupled up. Another engine was found, but its lubrication piping was damaged, then another, but its air brakes weren't working. Eventually, the Germans got fed up with the constantly broken engines, and so several German mechanics were ordered to get something in working order. An engine was quickly repaired and pressed into service, but miscommunication caused it to get lost in the marshalling yard where it remained for the rest of the day. At noon, a freight train arrived, which was quickly reassigned to pull the prison train. But yet another error ended up with it in a yard on the other side of Brussels. Eventually, an engine was found, but no driver or fireman was available to operate it. One driver said it was the end of his shift and went home. When the replacement driver arrived, he requested to pick up his wages first, as was custom on a Saturday, before vanishing. A driver was eventually found and ordered to the engine. He tried to stall and take his time, but realizing that the Germans weren't buying the act, he deliberately fell off the engine's footplate and wouldn't stop yelling in pain until he was taken away. Having had enough of the increasingly obvious sabotage attempts, a group of SS guards found driver Louis Verregel and fireman Leon Pochet and marched them to Type 12 locomotive number 1202 at gunpoint. The engine was readied and coupled to the prison train along with a van carrying several German machine gunners. 3 guards stood on the footplate with guns pointed at the driver and fireman to ensure they wouldn't try anything. Luckily, the guards knew little about railway operations and the stations ahead were ready to cause more frustration. The prison train finally left the station at 4:50 PM, only to immediately drive straight into the marshalling yard. In the confusion, the train was redirected south to Vorst Station, where the station master had accepted an incoming freight train on the main line. The prison train was forced into a siding while the freight train was split up and shunted around. Verregel and Pochet took the opportunity to refill the engine with water, while another flak wagon equipped with an anti-aircraft gun was connected to the end of the train. It was nearly an hour before the train moved again, stopping in Saarbeck marshalling yard. The signal was set to clear, but Verregel stopped the train as he wanted to request a pilot engine to help him through the yard. The guards, however, forced him back to the controls, with one of them warning, "Maschine kaputt, du kaputt." It was about 6 PM and the train that should have been in Germany by now had only just left Brussels. The train was made to continue on to Mechlin, where it stopped once again, this time by a signal along the line. It remained stationary for a while until an impatient guard made the driver continue despite the signal being set to stop. Finally in Mechlin, the train stopped once more, but this time for good reason. The signals were broken due to damage caused by Allied bombings, and Verregel had to use a nearby phone to call ahead to check if the line was clear. Initially, the guards were skeptical, but upon realizing he was telling the truth, 2 guards escorted him to a phone while one remained with Pochet. During the call, both men had left the vapor release open to help drain the engine of water. Once the train set off again, they requested that they stop and refill at Mechlin. Both driver and fireman knew that the water towers in Mechlin Yard were out of order due to Allied bombings, and so by the time they arrived at 11:40 PM, they had to be diverted to Mausen Station where the train remained for the rest of the night. The crew filled the engine with water while the station master kept the train from leaving. By this point, everyone was exhausted. The engine crew had been stalling and operating the locomotive for over 8 hours with guns pointed at their backs, the German guards had practically been awake and alert all day, and the prisoners were still crammed in the vans and running out of food and water. At midnight, gunshots and explosions could be heard in the distance from approaching Allied forces. The prisoners were hopeful, but an SS officer warned them that 3 of them at random would be lined up and shot should any of them try to escape. By dawn, the fighting had ceased, and the Germans were anxious to get out of Belgium. 1202 was shunted to the front of the prison train, and the convoy set off again at 5:30 in the morning. The Type 12s were built to pull fast, light trains, and so it only made it to Mechlin when its wheels began to slip, and wouldn't you know it, its sanding gear failed too. Not wanting to waste more time, a Type 1 Pacific locomotive was ordered to take over the train. The Type 1's driver was filled in by Verreggen on the nature of the train, and both agreed to return to Brussels, which was made much easier thanks to the Germans believing it to be dangerous to travel north towards the Netherlands or directly east through Leuven due to resistance activity. As the locomotive had to shunt around while in Mausen, the anti-aircraft gun was positioned at the front of the train behind the locomotives. While waiting to depart, the guards requested that the gun be moved to the rear of the train, to which the driver happily obliged. Once the signal was given, both the Type 1 and 12 set off for Saarbeck with the prison train. Unfortunately for the guards, the driver had forgotten to couple the flat carriage, and so the train quickly raced off without it. Back at Brussels, German forces were in a panic trying to flee from the Allies, and the railway workers were more than happy to slack off and take an easy Sunday at their expense, until news came that the prison train would be arriving back at Klein Island Station. Knowing German commanders would immediately send the train away again, everyone who could helped further sabotage engines, points, signals, and anything that could cause further confusion. By the time the train arrived at 10:15, everyone under German command was frantic. All available engines had been sent elsewhere, and the only one left was reserved for a Red Cross train. The prison train had only been in the station a few minutes when the driver of the Type 1 was ordered at gunpoint to couple his engine onto a commander's train. Verreggen and Pesho felt it best to make their engine unusable and themselves scarce, and so Verreggen stepped off the footplate pretending to inspect the engine before running away at the first opportunity. 2 of the guards had abandoned the engine once it arrived, leaving one still pointing a gun at Pesho. Pesho set about looking busy while discreetly dropping the engine's fire, and when the right moment arose, he ran off too. The yard signals were all set to clear, meaning no trains were stopping at the station for German command to commandeer. With no crew and 1202's fire now gone out, the prison train wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't long before officials were in the office of the German station commander, negotiating the release of the prisoners. The commander was adamant that the prisoners be moved back to Saint-Gilles, but eventually agreed to let them all free apart from one van that carried captured Allied airmen, who were to remain as prisoners of war. At 12:30 PM, orders to free the prisoners reached the station, and the doors of the cattle vans were opened. Everyone was quite thankful to be able to stretch their legs and return home to their families. It's not clear what exactly happened to the van containing the airmen who were to be prisoners of war, but it's likely that they too were turned free, as by 7 PM that same day, the Allied forces finally reached Brussels and liberated Belgium's capital. Both Verreggen and Pesho were effectively knighted for their actions, and railwaymen who told stories of the event came to refer to 1202 and its antics as the Ghost Train. There have been countless examples of railway sabotage and espionage during the Second World War, but few are quite as comical in retrospect as this one. Just goes to show then that not every ghost train is malicious or full of spooky spirits, some of them save lives. Subscribe for more.